Hello, everybody, and it's good to be back with you on Thursday, and I look forward to our time together in the Gospel of Matthew. Today, specifically, I want to look at Matthew 12, 1 through 21. So if you want to go ahead and stop the video right now, I encourage you to stop and read Matthew 12, 1 through 21. All right, I'll assume that you have done that. So let's talk about the progression of Matthew up to this point, because I think that's going to be might be very helpful for you to understand what's going on in the ministry of Jesus. So we are in the second stage of the ministry of Jesus in Gospel of Matthew. Basically, there are three stages. And so we are in the second stage. Things are a little different than they were in the first stage. In the first stage of the ministry of Jesus, you have a lot of interaction with large crowds. In this second stage, you don't have that as much. In fact, in the second stage, you have more of Jesus preparing his disciples for a couple things. But it's more of a direct interaction between the disciples and Jesus in this second stage. The third stage is basically going to be the end, the last week of Jesus' life, his death, resurrection. And so that's where we're going. But right now, Jesus is kind of pouring himself into his disciples. So he's preparing them for his upcoming death. They're not ready for it. In fact, it's probably the farthest thing from their imagination that this could be happening. So he is preparing them for that because it will be quite shocking to them when this happens. And the second thing he's preparing them for is early leadership in the church. And so they are going to be the ones who get the ball rolling in Acts. And so when we get to Acts, we do see the early church being successful. There are lots of conversions. And so what Jesus is doing is he's preparing them, and we see that from later on, like in Acts, that he was successful in what he tried to do. So he's preparing them, and he's spending less time with large crowds, public crowds, and spending more private time with his disciples as he's preparing them. All right, let's look at 12, 1 through 8. We're going to look at three different sections here. So let's look at 12, 1 through 8. This is a controversy about doing some work on the Sabbath, basically is what it comes down to. So what's going on in this section is that Jesus and his disciples are out walking on the Sabbath. That would be a violation of itself if you were going so far. And so it seems like Jesus is pushing the envelope on some things here. Now, I want to discuss this a little bit more in depth and help you understand that Jesus is really not violating anything here, but more of a perception. But just understand this. He's probably trying to show people that some of the restrictions that have been handed down may not be applicable in all instances. But for instance, let's go with this. So let's go back to what we're doing here. He's plucking the grain. Now, are there any prohibitions in the Old Covenant about harvesting? Yes, there are. On the Sabbath, I should say. So Exodus 34, and it's verse 21. Exodus 34, verse 21, which would be part of the Old Covenant. This would be the Torah right here. Prohibits anyone from harvesting on the Sabbath. The key word there is harvesting. Okay? Harvesting. There's a difference between harvesting and plucking. Now I'm making a fine distinction here, but you'll understand here in just a moment. So there is prohibition against harvesting on the Sabbath. Now, also in the Old Covenant, specifically in Leviticus 19, 9 through 10, there are demands upon landowners that they leave outer strips of their field unharvested. And they're supposed to leave those fields for the poor and needy. So when the poor and needy come along and need it, they can pluck it and gather it. And there was not any restrictions on when the poor and needy could come. Obviously, poor and needy don't have storage of food. And it'd be hard to have storage of food back then, but some people could store more things than others. Obviously, if you had wealth, you could store more things. The poor and needy can't do that. A lot of times, they may not even have a home to store certain things. So, seems like Leviticus 19, 9 through 10 basically says if you have a need, then it's all right for you to pluck some grain for your own personal need. Not harvest, though. Just get what you need. So what's going on here doesn't seem to be a violation of gathering too much. That would have been one of the things that people would say, like, they were taught early on, the Israelites in the wilderness journey, when the manna come down, that on the day before the Sabbath that they needed to collect twice as much so they wouldn't collect on Saturday. If you have some place to store these things, but these are different circumstances here that we're at when we get to the part about the instructions from Exodus and the instructions from Leviticus and how all this works. Things are much, much different at this time. So I don't see this as being a violation of harvesting, because they're not harvesting. They're not carrying baskets around. They're not taking some back to sell. They're not taking back to give to other people. They're just taking basically what they need at that moment. You can think of it as like a snack. That's what they're doing. In fact, if you had to eat this grain, you would have to be very, very hungry, because it is not pleasant tasting. They're probably eating some barley or something. It is not very good stuff. But anyway, Jesus knows that this prohibition has been added to by the Pharisees. So, for instance, the way that the ancient Jewish people dealt with a lot of these situations is that they provided case laws. And so if you had a law, they'd give you some kind of a situation, how you apply this in certain areas. Well, there's a book, there's nothing else to say. It's a book of Jewish interpretations of the Old Covenant. It's been around forever. It's called the Mishnah. They still use it today, somewhat. But the Mishnah is rabbinic interpretations of covenantal guidelines. And in the Mishnah, there's a section on the Sabbath. This is where we have the 39 additional rules that are added to the command, do not do any work on the Sabbath. Well, they define what the Sabbath is. And part of that was about picking grain. Well, that's not what the text says. It says don't harvest. It doesn't say anything about picking. And again, if you're poor and needy, you might have to go and pick some grain on that day in order to get you through to the next day. So this is not really a violation in the truest sense. This is only a violation in the way that the Pharisees are perceiving things. And it could be that they understand these exceptions and all they're really wanting to do is to harass Jesus, which very well could be. But anyway, in verse 1, the narrator sets out very early. He wants us to know that this event happens on the Sabbath. When a narrator gives you information like that, you need to focus on it, and you need to think about the importance of that information within this episode. So it's happening on the Sabbath. So that should our radar should go up at that time, because we know things about the Sabbath. We know how the Jewish people thought about the Sabbath, and so we expect some kind of problem to occur. Now, the Pharisees see the disciples plucking and eating the grain. Like I said, the disciples must be very hungry, because this is not something that you would want to do. And it is the Pharisees, it's not the Sadducees or scribes. It could be scribes, it could have been, but it's the Pharisees because they're in a rural setting. The reason why I say it could be scribes is because Pharisees had scribes also. But it's not the Sadducees. Sadducees work in the temple, so they're in Jerusalem. They are the Levites. Sadducees are the Levitical line. Pharisees are not. They are just regular folk who have dedicated their lives to the study of Scripture. That's basically what they are. They are the leaders in the synagogues. They would have been people who went around teaching the law to regular folks, so forth and so on. So it's the Pharisees because they're in this rural area. That's where the Pharisees worked at, was in rural areas. So if the Pharisees approach Jesus and they don't approach the disciples, now I think that is respectful of Jesus. Whatever you say about the Pharisees, they cause Jesus some trouble, but they do respect his authority with his disciples. They will not cross that line of rebuking his disciples. What they do is they honor his authority, so they go back to him. They ask Jesus, why are your disciples doing this? And the idea would be, why are you not scolding them for doing this? Why don't you know better? Because they expect him to scold the disciples. Instead, Jesus does something different. He doesn't respond the way that they want him to respond. In fact, he responds with a question from Scripture. Now, what's so interesting about this is when he responds with this, he asks the Pharisees, Have you not read? Have you not read? Which is interesting. For example, we think about the Sermon on the Mount, specifically chapter 5. And in chapter 5 of Matthew, Jesus says 6 times to the people, he says, you have heard, but I tell you. He says, you have heard to regular folk, but when he's talking to Pharisees, he says, have you not read? These would be people who had had access to Scripture. Remember, they have dedicated their lives to study. So they have read Scripture. So they should know about this, and they should contemplated this, but they have not. So in a way, Jesus is letting them know that they don't know Scripture as well as they think they do. They've not considered this situation. So Jesus recalls a situation in the life of David. So it comes from 1 Samuel chapter 21, verses 1 through 6. Now, this is a period in David's life when he has already been declared the next king of Israel, but the king that presently reigns, Saul, has not accepted this. And so basically Saul was fired by God, and David was to be inserted, except Saul didn't follow the instructions. Saul didn't get the memo. Saul is very angry at David. He is envious of David, and so he sets about to try to kill David. And this time, David is basically fleeing the anger and the outreach of Saul, who's trying to harm him. And so he has some men with him, and they're hungry, and they stop at the tabernacle in Nob, and they have some of the showbread that's supposed to be dedicated to the Lord, but they eat it for themselves. Now, and it happens on a Sabbath. And so, because it's in the Scripture, they would have accepted, in fact, the Pharisees would have accepted this portion of text as being authoritative. One of the differences between the Sadducees and the Pharisees is what they accept as authoritative texts. So the Sadducees are the most conservative. They only accept the texts of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. That's all they accept. The first 5 books, Genesis to Deuteronomy, the Pentateuch, that's all they have. That's their authoritative text. The Pharisees are expansive. They add basically all of the Old Testament that we consider authoritative and rabbinic teaching. So they've added quite a bit to the text. So when he brings out this story from 1 Samuel, this is an area where the Pharisees would consider this to be authoritative text. Sadducees would not. If he'd brought this up to Sadducees, they'd be like, well, that's not authoritative text anyway, so it doesn't matter. But the Pharisees can't do that, claim that argument, because they accept this as being authoritative. And so he reminds them of this time when David did this on the Sabbath, and the priests were fine with it. Next, there's an Old Testament illusion, and it's about. Let me pull up my text here real quick. So he was bringing up. He brought up David, and then he says about eating the bread of presence. Okay, and so then in verse 5. This is what I was getting at. Verse 5. He talks about the practices of priests on Sabbath. And so their function, what is it that they do? And so on the Sabbath, they have to prepare sacrifices. They have to go through the ritualistic practices associated with those sacrifices and any kind of worship rituals. So they are, in a simplistic way, they're doing work. And so they're doing work on the Sabbath, so why is it okay there? So there's a couple exceptions he's talking about there. And they're doing this stuff in the temple. All right? Now, so the point Jesus is trying to make is that there are times when activity on a Sabbath is allowable. You can't say there is not. We have 2 instances right here, just off the top of his head. Jesus brings this out. So these 2 times are allowable. So if there are 2 times, could there not be more? Obviously there are. So then Jesus goes on and states his significance in reference to the temple. Okay, so he says basically there's something greater than the temple here. The priests work in the temple, and there's something greater than the temple here. All right, so if people are working because of some kind of need that I have, or because of some kind of function that has to be done, then it's okay. Now think about it this way. Practically, Jesus is God in human form. So we think about the practical application of this. Practically, Jesus is being God in human form. Yes, that's something you have to accept by faith, but we know that the Bible is true and accurate, so when Jesus says it is so, then we believe it to be true. So Jesus is God. So that is always going to be, the recognition of Jesus as God is always going to be of greater value than the temple, meaning that Jesus is of greater value than the temple itself. He's God. Okay, so as God, he would have resided in the temple, but the temple's not greater than him. He is greater than the temple. Now, another thing about this, it's interesting. Bringing up the temple means that Jesus is basically casting the old covenant, because the temple was centered around the old covenant was centered around the temple, and the new covenant is centered around Jesus. And so Jesus is greater than the temple. The new covenant is greater than the old covenant. That kind of idea. So there's something greater going on here, and they're not recognizing it. And it's shame on them. Not a shame on Jesus. It's a shame on them. They should be recognizing it. Now, he quotes from Hosea in verse 7. Verse 7, he quotes from Hosea 6:6. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. This is the second time in Matthew that he's used this passage. First time he used it in chapter 9, verse 13. And so he's quoted from Hosea 6:6 twice. Now Jesus answers, why is this so important? He says, I desire mercy and not sacrifice. And basically, he goes on and says, if you practice this, you would not have condemned the guiltless. Or the innocent. And so he uses this to talk about being more merciful people, in a sense. We need to be merciful upon the innocent. The Pharisees need to be merciful upon the innocent. The disciples are innocent in this situation. Jesus is innocent in this situation, so they should be practicing mercy. Of all things, even though Jesus has already stated there are times of exceptions, they still should be practicing mercy. So Jesus, and after that, he basically, in verse 8, he says that he is Lord of the Sabbath. So basically he's saying, I have authority over the Sabbath to do what it is that I need to do. And this sets us up for the next part, which is very important. It's going to be a healing on the Sabbath. So verses 9 through 13. So Jesus has established that he can do things on the Sabbath. There are exceptions in the covenant for practices. And here's another one that he's going to show them. So in verses 9 through 13, Jesus is going to heal on the Sabbath. So it's all happening on that same day. Now, he talks about helping out an animal out of a pit, or it falls in a hole or something. You help the sheep out, lift it out. This idea of doing this kind of stuff comes from Exodus 23, 4 through 5, and Deuteronomy 22, verse 4. And the idea is that if there is an animal loose, even if it's your enemy's animal, you need to gather up that animal and take it back to the original owner. It doesn't say not to do it on the Sabbath. It says that anytime you see this happening, or you witness this or experience this, you go get that animal and you take that animal back to the owner, even on a Sabbath. And his reasoning is, if we're supposed to do this with animals, make sure that the animals stay safe, or help them in some kind of situation, then why wouldn't we help out a person? People are greater than animals, just like Jesus is greater than the temple. Well, people are greater than animals, so this should be another time when it would be okay to help out someone. And Jesus does. And what ends up happening is that Jesus, at the very end here, verse 14, the Pharisees decide that they are going to plan to try to destroy him. So that's what happens out of this. For him being merciful and helping out other people, they want to destroy him. All right, the last part here, 15 through 21. Now, most of this is coming from Isaiah 42, 1 through 3. In fact, verses 18 through 21 is a citation of Isaiah 42, 1 through 3. I do want to talk about verse 17 just real quick. The word fulfill should not be used here. It's not the idea of achievement. what the idea is that this passage is going to be filled more to make it full. So there's more that can be added to it. This is the idea. So Isaiah 42 had something pertinent for the audience at that time, 700 years ago, and now it can be used again for the ministry of Jesus. Well, what do we find out is going on here? In verse 15, we find out that Jesus got away from there because obviously he senses the danger, and he heals people that are out, that are following him. But he tells them not to tell anyone. Don't tell anyone. And the not telling of anyone is to fulfill or to make full what was spoken through the prophet Isaiah. So not telling other people is the reason why he states Isaiah. Now, this passage, Isaiah 42, 1 through 3, is really a nice passage in order to describe the ministry of Jesus, but it's kind of odd that Matthew is the only gospel writer to use this passage. Only one. In fact, Matthew is the only New Testament writer to use Isaiah 42, 1 through 3. No other person uses it to describe anything about Jesus. So Matthew finds something in Isaiah that can also be used to describe the ministry of Jesus. He's adding to it. And so basically in this passage here, it talks about the gentleness of Jesus. He is not going to, even though there's danger out there, he's not going to act violently towards those people. He's not going to quarrel with them. He's not going to cry aloud, that kind of idea. But we also have another idea that's being presented here twice. Verse 18 and verse 21, we have the word Gentiles coming up. And so this is a way also for Jesus to state that, hey, this new covenant message, this message of reconciliation with God through me, the new covenant, is also available to non-Jewish people. And so he's beginning to prepare his disciples for a ministry that goes beyond the Jewish people and to non-Jewish people also. All right, I'm going to stop right there. And it's been good to be with you this Thursday. I hope you've enjoyed this part of Matthew chapter 12. Next week, we'll finish up the rest of chapter 12. And I look forward to seeing you on Sunday. Have a good day.